Comrades, let me speak plainly, for there is no time left for illusions. The most dangerous thing you can possess under this world, the most feared commodity of the ruling class, is not gold, not land, not armies, but awareness. Yes, awareness, an unflinching, uncompromising recognition of the chains that bind you, the systems that exploit you, the lies that are fed to you as if they were truths. Look around you. See the cities and factories, the offices and homes, each constructed on the labor of millions whose sweat and blood fill the coffers of a few. The rich pretend to govern with wisdom, the politicians claim neutrality, the laws promise justice, but these are not gestures of fairness, they are instruments of oppression. Capitalism, my comrades, is not a neutral system. It is a machine built to extract the wealth of the many for the benefit of the few. Every wage, every rationed hour of leisure, every illusory opportunity is a chain. And yet you are taught to accept it as freedom. To become aware of this, to recognize the structures of exploitation for what they truly are, is the first step toward liberation. It is dangerous because it awakens a truth the ruling class cannot allow, that their power rests solely on your ignorance, your disunity, your submission. Capitalism thrives not only on the extraction of labor but on the silencing of thought. It demands gratitude for survival, admiration for mediocrity, and silence in the face of injustice. It whispers, adjust, endure, obey, while it steals your time, your dignity, your life. Awareness, real, unflinching awareness, destroys this illusion. Do not underestimate the power of knowledge, for the ruling class does not. They fill your minds with distractions, with petty competitions, with ideology that masks your oppression. They teach you to blame your neighbors, to envy your co-workers, to see inequality as fate rather than as the deliberate design of systemic structures. They tell you to aspire to join the few, rather than to topple the hierarchy itself. And yet once awareness ignites within you, once you see the mechanisms of exploitation laid bare, the chains begin to tremble. But awareness alone is not enough. Consciousness without action is a flame that burns in isolation. The ruling class knows this. They understand that a single awakened worker can be marginalized, silenced, or co-opted, but a united class, aware of its common interests, is unstoppable. It is here, in the unity of labor, in the solidarity of the oppressed, that true power lies. The workers of the world, the farmers, the laborers, the poor, and the disenfranchised, your collective strength, is the only force capable of dismantling the structures that exploit you. The system depends on division. It thrives on pitting you against each other by race, by gender, by nationality, by occupation, so that your shared suffering is fragmented and your power is dispersed. Awareness reveals this deception. Awareness tells you that the same hands that toil beside you are your allies, not your enemies, that the chains that bind you are common, and that your liberation must be common as well. Only together can the machinery of oppression be disrupted. Only together can the few be dislodged from their thrones built on the sweat of the many. Do not be content with mere survival. The ruling class would have you grateful for breadcrumbs, content with the illusion of choice, distracted by the empty promise of upward mobility while your labor sustains their luxury. Awareness shows that survival is not a virtue when it comes at the cost of freedom, that the acceptance of exploitation is itself a form of complicity. And once you understand this, once you refuse to endure quietly, once you see that your labor is not a gift but a weapon, the world begins to change. History is written not by kings or billionaires, but by the mobilization of the oppressed. Revolutions are not accidents. They are the inevitable consequence of awareness coupled with action. Capitalism may be cunning, but it is brittle. Its power is dependent on the ignorance and inaction of the masses. Awareness, the dangerous incendiary, liberating awareness is the spark that sets this structure aflame. But the flame must be fanned by organization, by solidarity, by the unyielding determination to reclaim what is ours, the fruits of our labor, the dignity of our existence, the right to live as human beings, not as instruments of profit. Comrades, awaken, recognize the chains, understand the machinery, see the illusions, speak the truth, and do not merely awaken, organize, unite, act. The most dangerous thing you can own is awareness, and yet it is the most powerful weapon you possess. Wield it wisely, wield it collectively, and the world that the ruling class has stolen from you can be taken back, piece by piece, hour by hour, by the inexorable force of the conscious, united working class. Awareness is dangerous, yes, but for the oppressors, not for you. For you it is the dawn of freedom, the beginning of revolt, and the path toward a society built not on exploitation but on justice, equality, and the liberation of all humanity. Awareness is the spark that ignites the fire of revolution. To be truly aware under the weight of capitalism is to recognize the invisible chains that bind every aspect of your existence, to perceive the subtle yet unyielding mechanisms through which you labor. Your time, your energy, and even your thoughts are appropriated and converted into profit for the few. It is not merely knowledge of injustice, for knowledge alone can be passive, awareness is active, penetrating and transformative. It is the dangerous realization that the world around you, the structures that appear natural and immutable, are in fact constructed deliberately to maintain the domination of one class over another. Awareness is revolutionary, because it threatens the very foundation of the system. The ruling class knows this and fears it, for awareness awakens the oppressed to their own power and exposes the lie that their suffering is inevitable, personal, or deserved. Capitalism survives on illusion, on the belief that wealth is created by the fortunate alone, and that laborers exist to be grateful for whatever scraps they are permitted to gather. Awareness shatters this illusion, revealing that wealth is created by the toil of millions, concentrated in the hands of the few who have never labored for its creation. It unveils the exploitation that lies at the heart of every wage, every product, every service, showing that the system depends not on fairness but on extraction. Awareness makes one see the division between use value and exchange value, exposing how human labor is commodified and fetishized, how workers' time is measured, monitored, and monetized, while their needs, desires, and dignity are rendered secondary to the imperatives of profit. It is a knowledge that is simultaneously intellectual and visceral, for when you awaken to the mechanisms of exploitation, you feel the weight of your own subjugation and the extent to which your energy has been harnessed to enrich others. This awakening is dangerous not because it harms the individual, but because it threatens the social order. Those who possess awareness are no longer passive participants in a system designed to subjugate them. They become potential agents of disruption, carriers of a consciousness that cannot be silenced easily. They begin to question the legitimacy of laws, of customs, of hierarchies, of social narratives, and in doing so, they undermine the moral authority that the ruling class has long claimed. Awareness forces you to see that inequality is not accidental, that poverty is not a misfortune, that exploitation is not a quirk of mismanagement, but a deliberate structure maintained through ideology, coercion, and force. It transforms perception into insight, insight into refusal, and refusal into action. When workers become aware of the mechanisms that extract their labor and concentrate wealth, they see themselves not as isolated individuals competing for survival, but as members of a class whose shared interests and collective power have been hidden, obscured, and intentionally divided. Awareness reveals the threads of interdependence that connect every exploited worker to another, every factory, farm, and office to the invisible machinery of profit. It exposes how division by race, gender, skill, or nationality is not a natural occurrence, but a calculated strategy to prevent unity and maintain control. Awareness is dangerous to the system because it allows individuals to recognize that they are not powerless, that the same hands that have been forced to build empires, harvest fields, and manufacture goods have the collective capacity to dismantle them. It brings clarity to the illusion of meritocracy, exposing the myth that individual effort alone determines success, revealing instead that systemic inequality favors inheritance, privilege, and manipulation while penalizing the laboring masses. It illuminates the ways in which ideology, media, education, and culture are wielded to normalize exploitation, to make subjugation appear natural, and to convince the oppressed that acceptance is virtue. Awareness disrupts this narrative. It turns passivity into inquiry, obedience into scrutiny, and acceptance into defiance. It is revolutionary because it does not merely observe oppression, it interprets it, contextualizes it, and lays bare its systemic character. Awareness is the lens through which workers can see their shared reality, connect their individual grievances to a collective struggle, and recognize that their liberation is inseparable from the dismantling of structures that exploit them. It is dangerous because once a worker awakens to these truths, their labor is no longer a silent offering, it becomes a conscious act, a potential instrument of resistance. Lever through which change can be demanded, organized, and ultimately achieved. Awareness transforms fear into insight, submission into determination, and survival into revolution. It is not enough to simply know that exploitation exists. Awareness requires understanding its mechanisms, tracing its pathways, and recognizing the deliberate structures that make it possible. This understanding carries within it the seeds of insurrection, for it is impossible to remain fully aware and yet remain passive indefinitely. It fosters solidarity among those who have been divided, courage among those who have been intimidated, and vision among those who have been misled. The ruling class fears this awareness because it cannot easily co-opt, ignore, or suppress it, and once it spreads among the oppressed, it becomes the foundation upon which revolutionary transformation can be built. The first and most dangerous weapon in the struggle to reclaim what has been stolen, the consciousness that is the precursor to collective action. The recognition that power is not an abstraction but a tangible force that belongs, ultimately, to those who produce all value yet possess none of the privileges of accumulation. Capitalism cannot exist without ignorance and division, for its survival depends not merely on economic structures but on the management of consciousness itself. The ruling class understands that control is not achieved solely through force or legislation, but through the subtle shaping of perception, the orchestration of thought, and the careful cultivation of disunity among those who produce the wealth of society. Ignorance is the soil in which the roots of oppression grow. Division is the water that nourishes it. To keep workers unaware of their true position in the social and economic hierarchy, to convince them that their struggles are personal rather than systemic, is to ensure the smooth functioning of a system built on exploitation. Workers are taught to see themselves, isolated individuals, competing for scarce resources, opportunities, and recognition, while the mechanisms that extract their labor and concentrate wealth in the hands of the few remain invisible. Schools, media, culture, and politics all contribute to this condition, presenting narratives that normalize inequality, glorify privilege, and obscure the realities of structural oppression. By fostering the illusion that success is the result of personal merit rather than systemic advantage, the ruling class diverts attention from the collective experience of exploitation and ensures that workers blame themselves or one another for conditions that are imposed upon them. Division is not an accident of society, it is a deliberate strategy. Workers are separated by skill, by occupation, by race, by gender, by nationality, and even by ideology, so that they fail to recognize their shared interests. Each of these divisions is amplified by institutions that claim neutrality while reinforcing hierarchy, creating mistrust, envy, and competition among those who should otherwise unite. The result is that the working class, the vast majority who generate all material wealth, remains fragmented, incapable of organizing effectively, and distracted by internal conflicts rather than directed toward the source of their oppression. Ignorance and division are maintained not only by overt manipulation, but by the subtle shaping of everyday life. Workers are told to focus on survival, to aspire to small victories within the confines of the system, to compete for promotions, recognition, or temporary relief, rather than to question the fairness of the system itself. Ideology convinces them that they are free while their choices are constrained, that their labor is voluntary while it is necessary for survival, and that dissent is dangerous while conformity is rewarded. In this way, ignorance is not merely a lack of information, it is a cultivated state of being, a form of mental enslavement that discourages critical reflection, class consciousness, and collective action. The ruling class understands that knowledge is power, and therefore it seeks to limit, distort, and control the dissemination of knowledge. Education may be provided, but it is structured to reproduce existing hierarchies, to train workers to be efficient instruments of production, rather than critical thinkers capable of questioning the legitimacy of the system. Media may inform, but it selects narratives that reinforce conformity, distract with spectacle, and promote individualism over solidarity. Political systems may promise representation, but they function to legitimize the authority of the few while co-opting dissent and preventing meaningful challenge. Division and ignorance are mutually reinforcing. When workers are unaware of the ways in which they are exploited, they are more susceptible to being turned against one another. Competition replaces cooperation, mistrust replaces solidarity, and fear replaces courage. By keeping the oppressed occupied with minor grievances, ideological conflicts, or manufactured insecurities, the ruling class prevents the emergence of collective consciousness, ensuring that rebellion is delayed and resistance fragmented. Historical examples abound of this strategy. The powers that be have always relied on dividing those who would otherwise unite, pitting ethnic groups, classes, or regions against each other, while the economic and political structures that benefit the elite remain intact. Awareness, once it emerges, reveals these divisions for what they are: deliberate, artificial, and counterproductive to the interests of the majority. Consciousness illuminates the fact that the labor of the many enriches the few, that the system is not neutral, and that solidarity is the most dangerous threat to entrenched power. It is only through awareness that workers can begin to dismantle the structures that rely on ignorance and division, to see that their true enemies are not their co-workers, neighbors, or communities, but the exploiters who profit from their fragmentation. Awareness fosters unity, transforms isolation into organization, and replaces competition with collaboration. It exposes the subtle ways in which capitalism manipulates thought, channels energy, and perpetuates hierarchy. It teaches that true power lies not in individual success within a corrupt system, but in the collective strength of a class united by shared interests, common grievances, and a vision of liberation. Once awareness spreads, division loses its potency, ignorance loses its shield, and the workers, the producers of all wealth, gain the capacity to challenge the system that has long kept them subjugated. The ruling class fears this awareness because it cannot easily divide, deceive, or dominate those who recognize the mechanisms of their oppression and the value of their unity, and in this lies the revolutionary potential that is both dangerous and inevitable. Unity is the weapon that the ruling class fears most, the force that alone possesses the power to dismantle the structures of oppression that have been meticulously constructed over centuries. Capitalism thrives on fragmentation, on the isolation of the individual from their class, from their neighbors, from the very people whose labor sustains the wealth and luxury of the few. It cultivates competition, rivalry, and mistrust, presenting society as a hierarchy of isolated actors whose success or failure is the result of personal merit, while the systemic extraction of labor and value continues unchecked. But collective organization and solidarity are the antidote to this carefully cultivated illusion. When workers recognize that their struggles are shared, that their labor binds them to one another in common purpose, the foundations of the oppressive system begin to tremble. Unity transforms vulnerability into strength, isolation into coordination, and helplessness into the capacity for decisive action. No individual, no matter how aware, can alone overturn entrenched power. Awareness must be paired with collective effort, for it is the mass, the organized multitude, that constitutes the force capable of challenging entrenched hierarchies. Solidarity is not merely emotional or symbolic. It is practical, strategic, and revolutionary. It manifests in the organization of labor, the coordination of strikes, the formation of unions, and the building of networks that link one community of workers to another across cities, regions, and nations. It is the conscious recognition that the freedom of one is inseparable from the freedom of all, and that no reform granted by the ruling class can substitute for the power of the united, oppressed to assert their rights and reclaim their labor. Historically, the ruling class has always understood the danger of unity among those it seeks to dominate. Every tool of division, from ethnic and religious tensions to economic competition and ideological indoctrination, has been employed to prevent the working class from organizing. Where solidarity is absent, exploitation is easier, authority is unquestioned, and oppression persists unchallenged. But where unity emerges, the structures that once seemed permanent reveal themselves as fragile, reliant not on inevitability but on the fragmentation of those they exploit. Collective action is therefore not optional, it is necessary. The individual worker may endure for a time, may survive under conditions of injustice, but only the organized class has the capacity to redefine the terms of existence, to claim the value of its labor, and to restructure society in accordance with justice rather than profit. Solidarity transforms individual grievances into a shared platform of resistance. It allows workers to pool resources, to protect one another, and to amplify their demands beyond what a single voice could ever achieve. Through collective organization, the oppressed become architects of their own liberation, rather than passive recipients of concessions from a system designed to exploit them. Unity is also ideological. It nurtures class consciousness, teaching workers to see beyond their immediate struggles to the broader patterns of exploitation, to recognize that personal hardships are connected to systemic inequalities, and that the liberation of all depends on a shared struggle. This consciousness fosters courage, perseverance, and strategic thinking, allowing workers to anticipate the maneuvers of the ruling class, to resist co-optation, and to sustain their movement even in the face of intimidation or repression. Furthermore, unity extends beyond the factory floor, the office, or the farm. It must encompass communities, neighborhoods, and nations, linking struggles across lines of geography, language, and culture. Capitalism is global, and the exploitation of labor is a transnational phenomenon. Solidarity must therefore be global as well, a network of mutual support and collective resistance that recognizes that the oppression of one group anywhere threatens the freedom of all. Unity is not passive compliance but active coordination. It requires planning, communication, shared principles, and disciplined action. It demands that individuals subordinate momentary self-interest to the long-term goals of the collective, that they trust and support one another, and that they recognize that their power is multiplied when harnessed collectively. This is why the ruling class invests so heavily in propaganda, divisive rhetoric, and systems of surveillance. They fear not the awareness of a single worker, but the conscious, coordinated action of a united class. Through unity, the oppressed can confront and dismantle systems that were previously thought invincible. Strikes, protests, boycotts, and organized resistance are not merely reactions to exploitation. They are proactive exercises of collective power, demonstrations that the working class, when united, cannot be ignored or suppressed indefinitely. History demonstrates that when solidarity is achieved, concessions are won, rights are reclaimed, and entire systems are forced to adapt or collapse. The path to liberation is therefore inseparable from organization. Awareness alone is insufficient. Knowledge must be mobilized, consciousness must be operationalized, and the collective must act in unison to translate insight into transformation. Solidarity transforms the potential energy of awareness into the kinetic force of revolution, proving that the true power lies not in individual effort or isolated dissent, but in the deliberate, coordinated, unrelenting unity of those who have been oppressed, exploited, and silenced. Through unity, the working class can become an unstoppable force, a living embodiment of the principle that the collective strength of the many outweighs the isolated power of the few, and that systemic injustice can only endure where solidarity has yet to awaken and assert itself in full revolutionary force. Survival under capitalism is often presented as an achievement, a virtue, a sign of resilience. Workers are told to endure, to be grateful for the scraps offered to them, to accept hardship as a natural condition and view the accumulation of wealth by the few as inevitable. But survival alone is not liberation. To survive while your labor is stolen, your rights are suppressed, and your dignity is compromised is not to live freely. It is to exist within a system of coercion and exploitation, bound by invisible chains that profit from your endurance. Grateful endurance is a subtle form of complicity, a mechanism by which the oppressed are conditioned to participate in their own subjugation. By accepting hardship without resistance, by expressing gratitude for mere survival, workers internalize the logic of oppression, treating exploitation as a normal or even desirable state of affairs. This gratitude is not genuine. It is imposed, reinforced by ideology, culture, and institutions that teach obedience, humility, and deference to those who benefit from your labor. When survival is elevated to a moral achievement, where enduring oppression is framed as strength, the system continues unchallenged and the very concept of freedom is obscured. Liberation requires more than mere existence. It requires the reclamation of what is rightfully yours, your labor, your time, your dignity, and your capacity to shape your life according to your needs rather than the demands of profit. Labor under capitalism is not simply work. It is a commodified exchange in which the value you create is appropriated by those who have contributed nothing except capital. To endure without challenging this arrangement is to consent, tacitly or explicitly, to the continuation of theft. True freedom, therefore, begins with the recognition that your labor is yours, and that it has been taken from you by systems designed to enrich others at your expense. Reclaiming labor is not merely a material act, it is symbolic, moral, and revolutionary. It is an assertion that your contributions have value, that your efforts cannot be invisibly harvested for someone else as benefit, and that your capacity to produce wealth is inseparable from your right to determine its use. Dignity is inseparable from labor. When workers are forced to survive at the whim of others, their dignity is eroded by dependency, by the constant subordination to external authority, and by the normalization of exploitation. Dignity is restored when labor is recognized as a human act, rather than a commodity, when the effort of the many is acknowledged and respected, and when individuals and communities reclaim the fruits of their work for the collective benefit rather than the private enrichment of the few. Survival without liberation is a prison with invisible bars. Workers may have food, shelter, or wages, but these are given at the discretion of the system. That controls every aspect of their existence. Life is reduced to a cycle of compliance, submission, and endurance, where the energy and creativity of millions are harnessed for profit, and the potential for self-determination is suppressed. Liberation, in contrast, transforms survival into life lived with purpose, agency, and autonomy. It requires refusing the false narratives that present exploitation as inevitability and gratitude as virtue. It demands that workers not only recognize injustice but act to correct it, to reclaim control over the conditions of their existence, and to organize collectively to ensure that labor and dignity are restored to those who produce society's wealth. Grateful endurance also masks the structural nature of inequality. By framing survival as achievement, the system convinces individuals that poverty, marginalization, and exploitation are personal failures rather than consequences of a deliberate arrangement designed to maintain the power and privilege of a few. Awareness shatters this illusion, revealing that the endurance demanded by capitalism is not noble but imposed, not necessary but manufactured, and not a sign of virtue but a mechanism of control. Reclaiming labor is therefore both an act of resistance and an assertion of self-worth. It asserts that work is not a debt owed to those who have already accumulated wealth, but a human activity that embodies creativity, effort, and the capacity for social contribution. When workers reclaim labor, they reclaim dignity, and when dignity is reclaimed, survival transforms into freedom. Liberation cannot be granted by the ruling class because it threatens their control and profits. It can only be seized by those who understand that existence without autonomy is subjugation, that life without agency is slavery, and that endurance without action perpetuates the very system that exploits them. Survival, stripped of dignity and independence, becomes a form of quiet bondage, while liberation transforms the same existence into a stage for the assertion of rights, the reclamation of labor, and the restoration of humanity to a system designed to deny it. True freedom is not a temporary reprieve or a charitable concession. It is the reclamation of what has been taken, the organization of labor, for collective benefit rather than private enrichment, and the unwavering insistence that dignity cannot be sacrificed at the altar of survival. To survive without reclaiming labor and dignity is to live under the authority of exploitation, to endure under the weight of imposed subjugation, and to accept a life defined by others rather than by one, as own conscious choices. Awareness, no matter how profound or piercing, is powerless without action. Consciousness alone can illuminate injustice, reveal exploitation, and expose the mechanisms of oppression, but it does not dismantle the structures that perpetuate it. Knowledge, if left unacted upon, can become an inert burden, a silent witness to injustice that accomplishes nothing but the sharpening of indignation. To awaken to the realities of capitalism is necessary, but it is only the first step in the transformation of society. Awareness must be translated into organized, deliberate, and collective action, for the ruling class maintains its dominance not merely through the extraction of labor, but through the passivity of the oppressed. They understand that consciousness, when isolated and uncoordinated, poses little threat. A single aware worker may question, may recognize exploitation, may feel outrage, but alone their power is minimal, easily marginalized or co-opted. It is only when awareness is shared, networked, and mobilized that it becomes revolutionary. Action is the material expression of consciousness. It converts thought into force, insight into pressure, and understanding into leverage. Without it, the potential of awareness is wasted, reduced to moral clarity without social effect, intellectual awakening without structural consequence. Organized action takes many forms: strikes, protests, boycotts, unions, mutual aid, community networks, political movements. Each is a manifestation of the principle that oppression can only be confronted collectively, that power accumulates in numbers, coordination, and strategy rather than in isolated individuals. Deliberate action is necessary because spontaneous outrage, though understandable, is easily suppressed. Unplanned resistance can be contained, fragmented, or misdirected, serving only to reinforce the illusion of control maintained by the ruling class. Consciousness, when paired with planning, discipline, and unity, becomes unstoppable. Action following awareness embodies the recognition that social transformation is not a gift, not a concession, but a task to be seized and executed by those whose labor sustains society. It is the practical realization of the idea that the working class is the engine of history, the force capable of overthrowing structures that exploit them. Awareness without action may breed despair, cynicism, or passive indignation, but action without consciousness risks aimlessness, futility, or the replication of oppression under new forms. The two are inseparable. Consciousness directs action, ensuring it targets the true sources of injustice, while action validates consciousness, proving that insight can produce tangible change. The ruling class relies on the inverse, a population that either acts without understanding, scattering energy and potential, or understands without acting, remaining isolated in thought. Both are forms of control, both perpetuate exploitation. The revolutionary imperative, therefore, is to bridge this gap, to harness awareness and channel it into structured, sustained and strategic efforts aimed at dismantling oppressive systems. This requires organization, not just in physical terms, but in ideological coherence. Workers must communicate, coordinate, and align their objectives, recognizing that individual grievances are linked to systemic oppression, and that collective pressure is the mechanism by which change is forced. Action must be deliberate. Reactive or haphazard gestures are insufficient to overcome entrenched power. Every strike, every protest, every act of resistance must be informed by understanding, guided by strategy, and reinforced by solidarity. Consciousness gives purpose, action gives effect. Together, they challenge the foundations of exploitation, redistribute power, and reclaim society from those who have long held it by force, deception, and the suppression of awareness. Social transformation is not gradual in the sense of incremental concessions, but inevitable when organized action follows collective consciousness. When workers recognize their shared interests and mobilize accordingly, the mechanisms of exploitation, wages stolen, labor appropriated, inequality normalized cannot withstand the pressure. Action makes visible what was once abstract, tangible what was once theoretical, and immediate what was once deferred. The history of revolutions demonstrates this principle. No change has been achieved by awareness alone, but no lasting movement has succeeded without it. The combination of consciousness and action is what shakes empires, topples tyrannies, and reconfigures society along lines of justice and equality. Awareness lights the path, but action carries the torch. It transforms knowledge into power, insight into leverage, and potential into reality. Without action, consciousness stagnates. Without consciousness, action misfires. Together, they form the twin engines of social transformation, the unstoppable force that exposes exploitation, confronts oppression, and reclaims the labor, dignity, and freedom of the many from the hands of the few. The revolutionary process depends on this inseparability, on the understanding that thinking alone does not free, and acting alone with insight does not change, and that it is only through the disciplined, organized, and sustained application of collective effort guided by awareness that society can be remade, injustice confronted, and the structures of oppression dismantled once and for all. Comrades, the path before us is not paved with comfort or compromise. The chains that bind us are not invisible by accident. They are deliberate, reinforced by the ignorance, division, and passivity that the ruling class cultivates. Awareness has revealed the mechanisms of exploitation. Unity has shown us the strength that lies in solidarity. The reclamation of our labor and dignity has illuminated the difference between mere survival and true freedom. And the call to action demands that we transform insight into organized resistance. The lesson is clear. Liberation is neither granted nor gradual. It is seized through the conscious, deliberate, and collective effort of those who have been oppressed. Every moment of endurance without resistance, every act of gratitude for scraps, every instance of submission, only prolongs the reign of those who profit from our labor. But when awareness spreads, when workers unite, when dignity is reclaimed, and when action follows consciousness, the very foundations of oppression tremble. History belongs to those who refuse to endure in silence, to those who understand that freedom is not given but made. Let us, therefore, take our knowledge, our solidarity, and our courage, and wield them as instruments of transformation. Let every act of labor, every voice raised in truth, every organized movement become a challenge to the structures that exploit us. The ruling class fears our awareness because it awakens a power they cannot co-opt, a force they cannot fully suppress, and a unity they cannot divide. Let that fear fuel our determination. Let that knowledge guide our action. The road to liberation is built by our hands, and the dawn of a just, equal, and free society lies within our collective grasp. Comrades, the time to rise is now, for awareness is dangerous, unity is unstoppable, dignity is non-negotiable, action is inevitable.